So minimum wage is a classic example, probably the most prevalent example of a price floor. A price floor says the price can't fall any lower than this. And remember, for a price floor or a price ceiling, any sort of price control, it's a binding price control if it stops the market from reaching free market equilibrium. So if you leave the market alone, it'll find its way to where supply intersects demand, right? Price will move around. If it's free to move freely, it'll move around until it finds its way there. So it's only an effective price control. It's only a binding price control if it stops the market from getting there. So a price ceiling would stop the price from getting any higher. So a price ceiling to have an effect would have to be below the equilibrium price. Price would be wanting to go up, but it can't. For a price floor to have an effect on the market, it has to stop the market from reaching equilibrium from the top. So a binding price floor is set above the equilibrium price. It's saying price would fall further if it could, but we're not letting it. Right? So in the case of minimum wage, I'm just going to say, let's say the equilibrium wage is $9 and we're employing 1,000 people at a price of $9. That's the equilibrium wage. If you left the market alone, it would find its way to equilibrium and the wage would be $9. So for a price floor to have any impact on that market, it has to be above the equilibrium wage. Because what if we set the minimum wage in this market at the federal minimum wage, which is $7.75? Yes, still $7.75 nationally, if in states that don't have their own statewide minimum. So if we said you can't pay less than $7.75, if we put a price floor of $7.75, that wouldn't have any effect on this market because it's going to find its way to that $9 wage. It's going to find its way to equilibrium. So a price floor that says you can't pay anything less than this, if you set that below where the market wants to be anyhow, there's not going to be any effect. And so for a price floor to have an effect on the market, it has to be above the equilibrium. And so an effective minimum wage, a minimum wage that's going to have an impact on the market, would be above the equilibrium wage. And so we know if price is above the equilibrium, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. I just put some numbers in here to make it a little more concrete. Quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and we have a surplus. The thing about the labor market, and I just want to emphasize and point out, is that what's being paid for here, right? When you go to work, your employer is hiring your labor. You are the supplier of labor in the market. Whoever's doing the working. The worker is the supplier in this case, which is a little different than we're used to. The firms, the employers, are the demanders of labor. They're the ones that decide how many workers do I want to hire. So the quantity demanded is how many workers firms want to hire at every price. The quantity supplied is how many workers are willing to work, or how many worker hours are being supplied at that price. And so the demand curve shows the firm's willingness to pay to hire another worker. The supply curve shows what the workers have to be paid to get them to work. You can think of it as the marginal cost of them providing their time to the employer. You have to pay me at least this much, or I'm going to do my next best use. Right? So the supply curve shows what you have to pay workers to get them to work. The demand curve shows what workers are worth to the firms. In equilibrium, if the price were free to move around, it would go to a wage of $9. If we impose a minimum wage at $11, the quantity of people that are willing to work exceeds the number of people firms want to hire, and we've got a surplus, which in the labor market we can refer to as unemployment. And this is the biggest complaint or concern about minimum wage, is that it causes unemployment. And it's, with a very simple supply and demand diagram, you can see exactly why that is, why that's a concern. If you keep the wage above the equilibrium wage, all these people are going to be unemployed. 300 people. If we didn't, we would have no unemployment. Now we have 300 people unemployed. Although it should be noted, we don't necessarily care the same about all 300 of these people, right? Because if we didn't have a minimum wage, we'd be at W0 and Q0. If we didn't have a minimum wage, 1,000 people would have a job. When we raise the minimum wage, 100 people who weren't looking for work before are now looking for work but can't find a job. They weren't working before. Now they've entered the labor market. The quantity of labor supply has gone up, but they can't find a job. So they are unemployed, but it's not like they would have been employed in the absence of minimum wage. So we care a little bit less about those. But these people, these worker hours that aren't hired from 800 to 1,000, those hours would have been hired at a wage of $9. So it's this chunk of unemployment, the people that would have been hired, the worker hours that would have been hired at a lower wage that aren't hired because of the minimum wage. That's where the significant cost comes in. Firms are willing to pay this much to hire them, the height of the demand curve. Workers only have to be paid that much to induce them to supply their labor. The willingness to pay exceeds the marginal cost on those units by that whole area. There's all this potential surplus that's going unrealized. And what do we call that? Unrealized potential surplus? Indeed, it's the deadweight loss. So again, anytime you interfere with the free operation of the market, if you keep it from reaching its free market competitive equilibrium, you're going to generate a welfare cost. There is going to be surplus that goes unrealized, potential gains to everyone that aren't happening, because these units, which are worth more to employers than it would cost workers to supply, they're not allowed to be hired, because even though I'm willing to pay this much, I'm not willing to pay the purple line. So these people don't have jobs. So this is the big concern about minimum wage, is that it generates unemployment. Why we do it, of course, is there's a cost, the welfare cost, the cost of efficiency, the lost surplus, that's the cost. Here is the benefit, right? These workers that still have a job are getting paid more. So there's always, in almost every situation, there are benefits and there are costs, and you just have to weigh them, and you hire economists to measure how big are the costs and how big are the benefits. But even then, you have to think normatively, when for your value system, what do you value, and how much do you value the benefits, and how much do you value the cost? So you can have people with very different positions on minimum wage, or raising minimum wage, or even raising a higher living wage, sorts of things in the fight for 15. But there's always a benefit and a cost. It's just a matter of how you normatively weigh them. And empirically, what economists can add to the debate is economists can and have done so many studies about the effects of changes in minimum wage, to try to see how big the happy blue smiley face is, and how big the unemployment effect is. What are we losing because of the imposition of the minimum wage? But you can see that there is this unemployment effect. It should be noted, though, that a lot of research, economic research, has shown that raising the minimum wage typically doesn't have a very significant unemployment effect. And I'm going to make a little list. I'll call it reasons why unemployment effect of minimum wage may be small. If you look at it, you can see by this graph, yeah, you keep the wage above the equilibrium wage, and there's going to be so effective a minimum wage increase. So say we raise the minimum wage, it's going to cause unemployment. Well, for one thing, it depends, as we've noted. That's not going to show up very well. As we've noted, minimum wage may be less than W star, less than the free market equilibrium wage. Meaning, like I said at the beginning of this, if you put a minimum wage down here, if the minimum wage is $7 and we raise it to $8, a $7 minimum wage has no impact on the market, an $8 minimum wage has no impact on the market. If you raise the minimum wage but it's still below the equilibrium wage, it's not going to have any effect on the market, right? Because the equilibrium wage is still higher. So it may be, maybe it's not below, but if it's not that high above, or you're raising it from just below the equilibrium wage to just above the equilibrium wage, that we can see a big unemployment difference. But you can see if we only raised it a little bit, if it was only a little bit above the equilibrium wage, that unemployment, the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, would be really small. So it's only in the cases of, say, maybe where equilibrium wage might be $10 and we say, let's raise the wage to $15, then there might be a more significant unemployment effect. And also, labor supply and demand are both fairly inelastic. What do I mean by that? I guess I'm going to erase this graph. I hate to do that, but I will. Inelastic meaning not very responsive. Remember what elasticity means. So inelastic, it doesn't look like that graph we drew before, but it looks more like, and the price in this market is the wage. Inelastic, remember, is pretty steep. The quantity is not very responsive to a change in price. So an inelastic demand would look something like that, and an inelastic supply would look something like that. Whoops. And so what we're saying when we say supply and demand are fairly inelastic is saying, so here's our equilibrium wage, our equilibrium employment. What we're saying is, even if you raise the wage significantly above equilibrium, there's minimum wage. The quantity demanded is here. The quantity supplied, a little bit of an angle there, is here. The difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is really, my lines were crooked, sorry, is really small. So there's the quantity demanded at minimum wage. Here's the quantity supplied. So yeah, there may be an unemployment effect, but it's not very big. And this is the case. Particularly minimum wage jobs, a lot of minimum wage jobs are in service sectors or areas where it's very labor intensive, like cleaning motel rooms or harvesting things that need to be harvested by hand, or all sorts of things that a lot of them, or retail in places where you want somebody, an actual person there. You can cut back childcare, daycare, things like that. You can cut back some. You can find ways to replace labor with capital some, or cut back on people's hours some. But in a lot of these cases, a lot of minimum wage industries, there's not a lot of substitutability. So yeah, you'll cut back some hours, but pretty much there's not going to be a huge decrease in the number of people hired. And at the same time, the number of people willing to work, it's not like, oh, I was getting paid, I won't work for $12 an hour, but I will work for $13. For small changes in minimum wage, you're not going to see a really significant change in the quantity of labor supplied either. Again, if it's a really big jump and really the wage is really significantly above equilibrium, then you might see more significant effects. But in general, because labor demand and labor supply are both fairly inelastic, even if you raise the wage fairly significantly, you're not going to see a very big unemployment effect. What you might see more is some of that increase in wage being passed off in terms of increased cost of goods, right? I can't fire my workers, but I have to pay them more, so I'm going to charge more for my product. And that does happen some, particularly you might expect to see it in food service industries, where the food service industry is the largest percentage minimum wage. Probably about 25 or 30% of the people in food service work at minimum wage. And so there will be some pass through, but research shows that it's not hugely significant. It's not even anywhere near close to, sometimes people say, oh, well, they get paid a higher wage, but the price of everything goes up so much. That's not true, because most people, I'll make that a number 3, most people don't work for minimum wage. So yeah, if you raise the minimum wage, prices of some really low skilled labor intensive production may go up a little bit, but there is a lot of production that isn't generated by minimum wage workers. So in the whole grand scheme of the overall level of prices in the economy, no, there's not going to be an increase in the cost of living that matches what people got an increase in pay. So if low skilled workers do get a wage increase, so they get that smiley face area there, they're getting paid more. The ones that still have jobs are getting paid more. That does not disappear because the prices are higher. That's just not a thing. Some prices of some goods are higher, but overall, because the vast majority of the workforce does not work for minimum wage, we don't see that entire raise being eroded. So again, just sort of thinking about these things, there's always a benefit, the benefit that we will get, but there's always the cost, right? There's the efficiency cost, there's the deadweight loss, these people that would have jobs that don't have jobs, the cost of unemployment. But you have to weigh the benefits against the cost, measure the benefits, measure the cost. So those are the important things. Is sometimes we get discrepancies because people measure the benefits and the cost differently. So you have to make sure you're measuring the benefits and measuring the cost correctly, and then you can say, here's the benefits, here are the costs, and normatively, I think the value of the smiley face area is worth what we're giving up in terms of unemployment, or I don't. Or, it may be different normative things, like simply you shouldn't be able to tell somebody what they're allowed to work for. If people want to work for a wage and people are willing to pay them, that should be up to them. Or you could say nobody should be allowed to work for below a certain level, because that's just like you're not allowed to sell yourself into servitude. We have laws against things like that. So maybe it's only fair that we have laws that say you can't hire people for less than this because it's just not right. Again, but that's normative. So I'm not here to make that normative determination for you. I'm just here to sort of let you, I like this example because we can use our simple supply and demand diagram and what we know about elasticity and things like that to sort of understand a little bit more about what the impacts are of a minimum wage and raising a minimum wage, and helping you be a little bit more informed when the debate comes up, as it inevitably does. And you can use your positive economic toolkit to help you inform any normative decisions that you might make.